Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm Bob Russell, the founder of the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences, and the Emeritus Professor of Theology and Science at the Graduate Theological Union. And I'm grateful for the John Temple Foundation for a generous grant that supports in part this project, Virtuous Artificial Intelligence ? Today, in the next 3 days, I'll be looking forward to you as to see how you answer the question mark. I want to thank Dr. Braden Molhoek for his incredible support in producing this grant and this project and running it, and for our many folks who've helped us along the way, especially Chang and San, who's a dental student here and a terrific person. I'm going to hand it over to Braden to introduce the project and then wish us all a great day of conversation.
Yeah, I think we have a few minutes just for a little short orientation this first day, and we'll probably have to repeat some things because I imagine that folks will be coming in and out throughout these 3 days. So if I'm monitoring the chat and the question and answer, so if people have questions, feel free to put things in there. I'm also finding the need to bring some of our panelists into the conversation. So if I'm missing somebody who's in the chat that should be with us here, please let me know. Yeah, so the grant really had its roots in something that CTNS had done several years ago. I believe it was 2018. Our journal, Theology and Science, had a special issue on CRISPR gene editing and virtue. Sort of the question of could you engineer virtue? And a lot of the thinkers came to the idea of no, that virtue is this stable disposition of character, something that you acquire over time through effort. And so we might be able to change human behavior through gene editing, but we can't necessarily instantly create virtue. And given the importance that artificial intelligence has been playing in the world scene, we thought that we wanted to be a part of that conversation and do something meaningful. And the metaphor that we came up with sort of through the grant process is that there's a lot of attention being given to a lot of issues in artificial intelligence. And we really wanted to be able to focus what we were doing in a particular way. And so we sort of say, well, we have this bucket of water in a grant, and what fire can we put it on that it might actually make a difference? Because there are lots of fire trucks and fire hoses aimed at big issues in AI already. And both as part of the Graduate Theological Union and from what the John Templeton Foundation wanted in terms of a wide variety of perspectives, worldviews, ways of thinking about emerging technology, we thought that virtue made a lot of sense to be a conversation partner. So we're very excited for what we have planned. This is the first of 3 conferences we'll be doing online this summer. There'll be some more information at our website, www.ctns.org, if you're interested in hearing what the other conferences will be. We'll be talking about similar themes, but different presenters. The content's always going to be different. So for today, and for the next couple days, I think the best way to proceed is we're going to give each participant a chance to sort of either give a summary or talk about where they feel like they need input or where they're stuck or we really want to maybe focus conversation on. And then the panelists and that author or co-authors will then have some conversation. But we would love to get input when we can from the general audience. So if you could put questions either in the question and answer or in the chat, if there's downtime during the half hour that a person has, we can try and bring some of those in. Otherwise, we have 2 dedicated times throughout the day for general question and answer. But I recognize that given the number of people that are involved, that may not be sufficient. So I've asked the panelists if they might be willing to respond to some people or some questions offline as well. And there's no commitment from them to do so. But if you are in the general audience, you would like to potentially have your question followed up on, if you would be willing to leave an email address with your question, that would be great. And if you use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, only the panelists and the host can see that, so you won't be sending your email address to the entirety of the chat if you do it that way. So if you have questions about that, you can put a message in chat. And again, there's no guarantee that it will happen, but I'm hoping that we might be able to continue some fruitful conversation even beyond the time limit that we have here. Yeah, our first presenter is Brian Green, and Brian is the Director of Technology Ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University, where he also teaches AI ethics in the Graduate School of Engineering and had formerly taught other graduate engineering courses. There's further information about all of our presenters on the CTNS website with the schedule. So I think I'll leave the introductions pretty short for now. So take it away, Brian.
Braden, thank you very much. All right. First, I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you, Bob and Braden, and everyone else who's involved in putting this grant together. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and the future evolution of virtue in human culture. I'm going to go really quickly to try to maximize our discussion time. But for me, really quickly, hopefully will actually be quick, and it might not be, but we'll see. We'll see. All right. So first thing I would say is that AI is already being used a lot, and it's directing human behavior in a lot of ways. So recommendation algorithms, optimization, addiction, all of these things are very much happening in human society already. We see them a lot. They're inculcating habits, and these are kind of virtues or vices. Habits in the philosophical sense, a disposition towards a good action is a virtue, a disposition towards bad actions are vices. And this is just kind of an outline of my paper. First of all, 4 examples of virtue and vice in society. Second, the decentralized or centralized scenarios for social impact of AI on virtue and vice. And number 3, what to do regarding the use and misuse of AI and proper use of AI to help guide society towards freedom and virtue. So first example is YouTube and the idea of unarticulated want. This is a paper that YouTube published in 2010, or rather some scientists, engineers at YouTube, saying that what is the purpose of YouTube? YouTube is trying to fulfill unarticulated want. In other words, you don't even know that you want it, but they're going to give it to you anyway. And this is the kind of background behind their algorithm suggesting and recommending things to you. So we might think to ourselves, oh, it's, pandering to our desires. It's giving me exactly what I want. It's maximized my freedom. But of course, that's not what it's doing. It's maximizing your eyeball time on watching their videos. It's not necessarily giving you what you want. And it's certainly not necessarily giving you anything that's good for you. So what are some vices and virtues that might be involved with this? Obviously, on the side of the platform, there's greed. There's also the sense of entitlement. Pride also, obliviousness, not caring necessarily what happens when you're not, other things that you should be doing, perhaps other than watching YouTube. User vices that are encouraged would, of course, include laziness, intemperance, impulsivity, imprudence. User virtues prevented, anything having to do with temperance and practical wisdom. And user vices due to content may include, and this is where I feel like this is the side effects section of the pharmaceutical label. So gullibility, paranoia, callousness, mindless or misplaced loyalty, misplaced trust or distrust, stubbornness, lust, greed, gluttony, sloth, envy, wrath, pride, etc. I got to get all the 7 deadly sins in there, plus a bunch more. Now, I'm not going to go through every single piece of the list for every slide that I go to, but at least on these first few, I'll try to say some of the vices and virtues more explicitly. So number 2, the example of how conspiracy theories are really getting pushed through social media. So Roger McNamee, who was involved with Facebook early on, is now kind of opposed to the whole idea of Facebook, has some big problems with it. He estimates about 2 million people were driven into QAnon groups by Facebook's recommendation algorithm. That's about 2/3 of the people who are in those groups on Facebook. And it's not just, of course, the content of QAnon, of course, being pretty crazy conspiracy theories. It's also the kind of form that the recommendation is given in, which is a form of manipulation of trust. We're going to recommend something to you, and then you're going to accept it. And these sorts of things, of course, there's also the vice there that was seen with YouTube in terms of greed. But there's also kind of a manipulativeness, also that obliviousness, entitlement, and pride. Some of the user vices that are encouraged, of course, would be gullibility or credulousness. You have to be pretty gullible, honestly, to believe some of these conspiracy theories that are out there. There's also paranoia, which is being facilitated by the conspiracy mindset. Imprudence, mindless, misplaced loyalty, misplaced trust and distrust, misplaced obedience, closed-mindedness, stubbornness, and ultimately resulting in foolhardiness if you end up storming the Capitol or attacking pizzerias because you think that there are children trapped inside. And some virtues that are prevented would be a healthy skepticism, a sense of empathy, prudence, and equanimity in your approach to life. All right. So number 3, I chose kind of a different lens to look at generative text algorithms. So Joanne Archibald Kumkumzian is a indigenous storyteller and academic, and she calls story work this idea that stories that give meaning to life are a form of story work. If we forget these stories, then our lives begin to lack meaning, and that starts to erode society if we start experiencing our lives as being meaningless. And ultimately, it's only these stories that can give us meaning because they tell us what we should be doing with ourselves. So generative text from large language models reduces text to statistical associations, which erases meaning. ChatGPT outputs are not story work. They're something that's parasitic upon the text that it has ingested, and it's ingested a lot of text. Some people have estimated that the database for ChatGPT or GPT-4 is something about 10% of the internet. So ChatGPT is not a storyteller as so much as it is a sort of story monster. It brings all these things together. It doesn't understand what it's doing. It puts them in statistical association with each other, and then it just kind of sprays it back at us as we prompt it to. So some of the platform virtues here, there are actually some virtues that are behind this. I know folks who are generating this stuff, and there is a benevolence there. They want to provide people with something that'll be useful. They also want their algorithm to be transparent in some ways. They want to promote understanding and prudence ultimately. However, there are also some vices behind there, I would say, which obliviousness is probably one of the primary one. Imprudence, irrational optimism, and naivete. And user vices. In just one use case, the educational system is being flooded with AI-generated material right now. And that is emphasizing user vices such as laziness, sneakiness, obtuseness, de-skilling, and actually choosing to be de-skilled, which is kind of a meta vice on top of that de-skilling vice, callousness, lack of empathy, and imprudence. The content also has a vice. So there's actually multiple different layers of types of vices that are involved here. The collection of the content for the data set, there's no consent, no credit, no compensation given to the people who have produced that content. That displays kind of a sense of entitlement, pride, callousness, ungratefulness, selfishness, short-sightedness, and imprudence. Some of the vices that are involved in the form of it, in other words, just producing text with no meaning behind it, would be forgetfulness, alienation, frivolity, imprudence, and decadence again. And then lots of people have actually been saying, oh, this is the start of artificial general intelligence. This is going to turn into something godlike. And what I would say some of the theological vices there would be hubris, imprudence, and ultimately idolatry. All right. 4th example, emerging totalitarian surveillance state. So AI is going to give us the ability to monitor people in ways previously unimaginable. The Chinese Communist Party has been engaging with this in China. They want to produce a harmonious society. They have the social credit score as a reward or a punishment. Smartphones act as the monitor and communicator and so on. And AI is kind of the glue that binds people together in this system with their government. And I kind of look at this as a kind of moral auto-tune. If you remember auto-tune, of course, in music these days, it automatically adjusts the pitch of whatever the person's singing to what the desired pitch is. So you can be singing really badly, but it'll still come out at least on pitch. Moral auto-tune takes human action and squeezes it into a form acceptable to the ears of the state, so to speak. And of course, this is not true virtue. This is much more of a vice. It gives you the output of what virtue would look like, or the consequences of it, if you want to think about it as a form of consequentialist ethics, while leaving the internal disposition of the person dealing with the system not in a virtuous state. we should say no to this moral auto-tune. I think it's fairly obvious. However, of course, I say it's fairly obvious, but the Chinese Communist Party does not believe it to be so. AI should be used not to force virtue, but to encourage, cultivate, or guide our free behavior towards virtue. And of course, there's a set of virtues or vices there also. And I won't go through all of these. So 2 scenarios for the future. I chose to look at the kind of centralized scenario and decentralized scenario. The centralized scenario, which I'm calling the Chinese dragon, and the American Western Hydra would be the decentralized scenario. So in the centralized scenario, authorities use AI for their ends, whatever they deem to be best. Virtue and vice are subject to the whims, of course, of the ruler or rulers or single ruler. And this very much bifurcates humanity into moral leaders and moral followers. The decentralized scenario is different. Aristotle, for example, said that the more people who are involved in government, the more likely it is to reflect the mean. And so if you have a lot of people, you're not going to be able to get extremely good or extremely bad. You'll get somewhere in the middle. And while this might make vice, or it makes virtue essentially impossible, it also makes extreme vice unlikely. So it led Aristotle to refer to democracy as the least degenerate of the degenerate forms of government. And if you are, if you're an idealist, then of course you want to have this most ideal form of government. You might actually construe that that's what China's trying to do. They have one virtuous person who's their leader, and everyone else is going to be virtuous based on that, with the AI as the enforcement. Of course, that is extremely dependent on that leader actually being good. Otherwise, you could have something extremely horrible at the same time. And of course, democracy is not likely to do that, even if it is a quote unquote degenerate form of government, according to Aristotle. At least it can't be that bad as a tyranny or a totalitarian state. So decentralization allows for diversity and experimentation. These may succeed or fail, but in either case, they're a learning opportunity. So decentralization is more experience-based in a lot of ways. It runs tests, it sees what works, it humbly responds to that information and updates based on that. Whereas a centralized scenario really makes experimentation with the government and choices much more difficult. And centralized regimes also tend to be a little bit more ideologically focused in a lot of ways. All right, a few variables. I'm not going to go through these in detail. How many people are involved? That's the number. The social role. What sort of people are the leaders? Moral quality. Are these people good? Are they bad? Is their intent good? Are their actions good? Are their consequences good? What's their level of involvement in terms of trying to control people? And also, what's the legitimacy? Do they actually belong there? Do they have the right to rule? All right, so centralization. What are some benefits, risks? So, of course, what are the primary benefits of it, of a centralized scenario, would be that you have a lot of control over what you can do. It's very powerful. And if you actually get good people running things, you can have a country that's running better than anything ever has before. China can actually make this argument in terms of their industrialization over the last 40 years. They've gone from, in the early 1980s, something very different from what they are right now in terms of their infrastructure and educational situation and things like that. What are the risks? Of course, it's extremely vulnerable to failure of leadership. Errors by the leadership are likely to be large, and they're likely to propagate disastrously. And let's see, I'll just skip along a little bit. So also, what's kind of the neutral side of this, just as a fact? Of course, if you have AI optimizing towards particular things, then followers are going to become homogenized towards whatever that optimization goal is. That's neutral because it could be either good or bad, but the fact is still there. And it also is a reduction of diversity, which can be a dangerous thing as well. All right, so what are the best, worst, and most likely outcomes? The ideal scenario would be that everybody just spontaneously works together and decides to have this kind of wonderful heavenly scenario where we all are completely free, but also completely choose to do good. No one would freely choose to do evil, kind of a heavenly scenario. The worst scenario is that one person who is highly controlling tries to take over everything and tell everyone exactly what to do. You can think of various totalitarian regimes in history where the government has been very involved trying to control people and exactly what they do. And it turns into, of course, a huge nightmare. What's the realistic scenario? Somewhere between the two, where it's going to be a mixture of virtue and vice involved in controlling people's behavior, but mostly insofar as it just keeps the lower people in the hierarchy in their place. All right, so decentralized scenario. Some of the benefits would be subsidiarity. Problems should be addressed at the lowest political level possible. This keeps the solution close to the people. It makes them more likely to accept it. It also prevents moral de-skilling. It also prevents or it protects freedom. So, AI might try to teach a person how to be morally aware, give them advice when appropriate. You can think of Jiminy Cricket in Pinocchio as perhaps an example of this. Decentralized scenarios are less brittle because the virtue is more individually internalized and there's less dependency on others. And also large errors are less likely to propagate in these scenarios, and they're more likely to be corrected quickly. What are some of the risks? There's a constant rate of error in a decentralized scenario. It risks poor leadership and could ultimately descend into anarchy. It can be uncompetitive if it is competing against a centralized system that's actually performing well. Despite running many experiments, decentralized scenarios might not actually learn from them or actually utilize those experiments towards anything good. Decentralized governments are just as likely to have ideology or lack of intellectual humility or group loyalty or things like that competing against each other. And of course, subsidiarity is great, but you actually have to escalate the problem to higher levels if the lower levels can't handle it, and that'll take time. And on a neutral side, it tends to be more diverse. Various organizations can go about their own pursuits without thinking about the overall thing of the system of society itself. But of course, with their freedom, they could either choose well or badly. And so I think of this as kind of like a many-headed hydra. It's resilient to attack. It's capable of addressing many problems at once, while it also tends to be confused and pulled in many directions. All right, what's the ideal? It's kind of, I won't go through this in detail, it's in the paper. The worst scenario, of course, is you have a small number of rulers who are all choosing to do evil and want everyone to do evil along with them. And the realistic scenario for this is kind of what we're dealing with right now in the Western world. You have a diverse set of people who are important for various reasons, but maybe they're a technological leader, political leader, celebrity. They're not all that interested in what people think as long as, it's stroking their ego or things like that. They each have their own little sphere of influence. And the problems that come from the system largely due to misaligned incentives rather than outright desire to do good or evil. All right. So Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle states that for an act to be considered good, it has to be the right act done in the right manner at the right time and for the right reason. If you're going to have AI contributing to kind of the development of human virtue, it needs to make sure that it's not interfering with those things. It can help with recommendations, but it needs to not force people to do things. Otherwise, they're not obeying or they're not cultivating virtue in themselves. They're just obeying an outside source. So in the hellish scenarios, whether they're centralized or not, they preclude most of Aristotle's requirements for virtue because they only coincide with virtue incidentally. And for this reason, the population becomes reduced to morally de-skilled followers who don't have their own autonomy. In the heavenly scenarios, it's the opposite. It doesn't matter whether it's centralized or not, but they will attempt to follow Aristotle's formula by assisting the cultivation of virtue and not trying to replace human virtues. These scenarios maintain freedom and the ability for individuals to seek the good on their own. All right. What I would say is a human agency is really the key concern here. Human agency, and this is another thing to realize, which is that AI agency, whenever we think about an AI doing something, it's actually people who have told it to do that. It's just people who are in the past who are trying to control the present and the future. So it's another form of kind of governance system. In the centralized scenarios, agency becomes extremely concentrated. And once again, it tries to control everyone. In the decentralized scenario, decision-making stays more widespread. But even then, AI advisors are going to be recommending to leaders what to do, and in many cases, to followers as well. And so this results in kind of the agency of ancestral engineers scenario, as I'm calling it, which is that these engineers from the past will control the future. I was talking to someone recently who said, you know what, if AI is writing all this code for us now, how is anyone ever going to create a new coding language? There will be no data set to build it on, and it's very unlikely anyone will want to try to use or create a new coding language because we already have AI that's writing in this kind of old language for us. we can think of that with morality. How's anybody going to come up with any sort of moral innovations if we're all basing any type of morality on the past that's already been chosen by people in the past to control people in the future in that way? And by the way, all these things are already happening in terms of what to consume, what reporters should be reporting on, or what type of content should be created. Physicians are already dealing with, clinical decision support systems. Military leaders, of course, are already thinking about scenario planning in terms of AI models, telling them what to do. AI is involved in logistics, all of these things. Go to the next slide. So what's the metaphor maybe we should think about here? I would say it's kind of the idea of human agency and what a good parent would try to do. A good parent tries to help their children learn how to behave well before going out into the world. So we know cultivation of virtue is possible. It largely happens in the family setting or in the setting of the educational system or in the cultural context with various ideas we're getting from society. But it's important to consider exactly how this is done. So forcing obedience ends up not actually producing morally autonomous individuals because they never learn how to make their own free decisions. On the other hand, if you just let children do whatever they want to, they end up making terrible mistakes, and that ends up stunting their moral growth through lack of guidance. So good parents need to strive to be the virtue between these two vices, enforcing obedience when necessary, but granting freedom when appropriate. And in general, you want people to be as free as possible, but you don't want them to be too free because otherwise it turns into anarchy, which then in turn reduces the ability for anyone to be free. As people grow in virtue, they become more and more autonomous. But if people grow in vice, then you need to do things to reduce their autonomy to prevent their vice from becoming more widespread, finding money, surveilling, and ultimately jailing people. The CCP's style of surveillance state actually gains a lot of the power of these controls of fines, monitors, and jails without actually going to these extremes. And that way it's kind of a subtle form of social control. However, it also kind of prevents virtue from ever happening in the first place. It assumes the worst of people and it stunts their ability to grow. And in that way, it really damages the ability for virtue to actually take hold in society. You might get the outer signs of some sorts of virtues, but you never get the actual virtue itself unless the people really internalize it. So, and of course, virtue requires cultivation, not construction. This is another Aristotelian distinction. You don't want to have AI as a dysfunctional parent controlling everyone. Instead, you want to have kind of virtue infused into society and giving people the opportunities for moral growth. The decentralized scenario, I think, is much more likely to produce this outcome, and centralization really tends towards the opposite. All right. And if the past is a foreign country, then the future is a foreign country also. We're all immigrating into that foreign country. And of course, this country is going to be very different than anything we can imagine. It might be amazing or it might be terrible. There may be a proper role for AI in moral education, perhaps teaching us from case studies and, making us aware of all the historical things that have gone before us. But it also needs to be up to the individual so they can adapt that and really be able to engage with the current society as it is. Because of course, the future is not the same as the past. And we don't want to have the ancestral engineers telling us everything to do if we're now in a world that's very changed and very different. So AI might someday be a guide in our moral development, but we're a long way from this point now. And I would argue that we have reason to be skeptical. All right, so that was longer winded than I was hoping for, but we still have a few minutes left. So I will stop sharing. And if I was going to ask a question of everyone, one of the questions I would ask is, have I chosen the right variables here? Is it really decentralization versus centralization, or is there a better variable than that? So for example, assuming the best or worst of people is another kind of important variable that I, detected as I was writing this paper. Because if you're in a system that always assumes the worst of people, it really kind of shortcuts their ability to ever form their own virtues and vices. Anyway, that's just one question I have up there. Mark, I see that your hand is raised.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I mean, that was great. I really enjoyed your paper and talk. I thought there were great examples, analyses, and scenarios. And I guess first, to answer your question, I think those variables are great. I think the decentralized and centralized is like an important aspect. I've got two suggestions and then also a question. So the first suggestion is a little bit more of a technical one. So especially in the paper on the generative text, You talked about statistical methods can't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it was a little confusing because like the statistical methods that are used with the language models are actually kind of built upon like human linguistics. So in like the 1950s, there were statistical methods for association and hypothesis about distribution. And then in the late 90s and aughts, there were models that were computational models that were built upon that then ended up kind of leading in. Then there was some evaluation of those psychologically, and then the embeddings of the last 10 or 15 years kind of built upon that. So like from a computational perspective, I mean, and there's certainly other linguistic theories, but from a kind of a computer science perspective, like it's just a model. It may not do it very well, but it's also kind of built upon the human. So I think some clarity there about like what you mean by understand and where that distinction is. And then also, I mean, there's that technical piece, but I also think like the saying that AI can't understand a story almost kind of stands on itself without that. Where you could be focusing on the affective part, you could say that, AI can't tell a story, even if it can tell a narrative, or it can't, tell a drama, even if it could create a dramatic narrative. It seems like there are other pieces other than just that linguistic piece. And then also in the kind of AI surveillance and agency, like it seems like Sin and Nussbaum's capability approach might be helpful. And I just wondered if, I didn't know if you thought about that because they emphasize the essential freedom. And then the question I have, which was that you argued from within virtue ethics, which makes sense for the conference. But I was just curious if this could apply if one took like a consequentialist or a deontological approach, or if you thought this was specific to virtue ethics.
Oh, great. That's a lot of questions. I'll try to just answer them rapidly. So what I was saying in terms of understanding is that the computer model itself can't understand, right? Humans, it's based on data of humans who understood what they were saying, presumably. And then we ask it through a prompt and we get something from it, which presumably makes sense to us. Hopefully it makes sense to us if the statistical associations are working properly. And then also, of course, the engineers who created the model have understanding. So there's three different areas of understanding there in terms of the input, the processing, and the output. But none of those actually have to do with the model itself, I would say. It's kind of like, Searle's Chinese room. It would be kind of the example of it. Let's see. Capabilities approach. I think that's a reasonable one, which is that you'd want to emphasize people having their own capabilities and capacities. But just merely having a capability or capacity doesn't necessarily dispose it towards virtue or vice. So kind of the next step would be, are we directing people towards being good, being kind, or things like that, or are we directing them towards something bad? And then the deontological or consequentialist framework. I think that you're right. A lot of this thinking here is very much focused on kind of getting the right consequences out of it. I mean, that's basically, if you're thinking about maximizing shareholder value, for example, that's a consequence that every big American corporation has to deal with, right? They're supposed to maximize shareholder value. And so in that way, that's what they're concentrating on. But they also have to recognize that they're having an impact on society. And if they're spreading conspiracy theories and sucking up everyone's time watching YouTube when they should be doing something else, they're actually damaging the society which they're trying to operate within, which is a form of short-sightedness. That didn't completely answer all your questions because they're
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, great talk. Thanks.
Let's go on to Shannon now. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Brian. Great talk. Really enjoyed it, and the paper as well. Just a couple quick things. One, I wondered if amongst the virtues and vices that you were exploring, if you felt this was already captured or if you thought it could be built out more. One that's really troubled me is that I feel like AI encourages a blindness to externalities. And specifically, I've been shocked by how few people have even noticed or read about how ChatGPT required the exploitation of Kenyan workers in order to get it up and running. and continues to have other externalities that people seem to block out. And I was just wondering if you thought that that was something you could build out too, because I do feel like in the world itself, when I work with my students, this has expanded tremendously, that we all struggle to pay attention to the consequences and the far-reaching effects of what we do, but AI seems to push them into greater invisibility, and that does certainly concerns me, and I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned that just very, very quickly in the paper, the idea of this kind of neo-colonial aspect to AI in terms of using overseas workers, and Karen Howe's work on that is fantastic. I don't know if we could say it's worse than things already are, right? Because we already have this kind of exploitative system set up. And so in this way, AI is really building upon a system that already exists and is built into the way our economy is structured. Then there's the further question of whether this is worse or not, or whether it's more anonymizing of them. It's anonymizing in that most people don't realize that their work is built into the system in a very structural way. The human feedback component of reinforcement learning with human feedback is really important. If they hadn't done that work, the system would not work properly. So their anonymity is absolutely built into the system. That's one of the forms of human understanding that permits the illusion of understanding to come forth from the model, or rather, at least presents something that we interpret as being humanly understandable. So it's definitely a very important thing. And in terms of virtues and vices, this kind of obliviousness or not seeing the bigger picture is going to become overall a much bigger problem, I think, going forward. As the world becomes more complex and individual human understanding remains finite because we are only individuals, and dealing with a much more complex world, much more of the world will escape our ability to understand it and grasp what's going on there. AI gives us the ability to maybe help with that, but it also depends on the AI actually being able to handle that in a way that is interpretable and useful to individuals also. So I think if there's an overall trend here, which is getting worse. So if I can agree with you if that's part of the point that you were making. All right.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Shannon. Let's go on to Elias.
Yes. Hi, Brian. Nice to see you here, and a great paper. I was both provoked, but I'm still kind of need your help to kind of flesh out the whole idea of the ancestral engineers kind of controlling the future. And in part, I think I see what you're saying, that they set up this language and then now AI is creating the code, and therefore there is a limitation there. But on the other hand, AI systems are very much fed by data. They take in human feedback. So in some ways, they're always evolving. So it's almost like in my mind, I'm struggling to see how can this initial AI system somehow become fixed by those engineers? To what extent do those engineers really have a say in fixing the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, it's going to vary from context to context, right? One of the things that people constantly get annoyed at when it comes to ChatGPT is that its data set cuts off in 2021, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. So, and they say, hey, how come it doesn't know that this happened, or that this movie came out, or things like that. So there is kind of there's a cutoff there. There's a way to set the model in stone, so to speak. But on the other hand, it doesn't need to be that way. You can constantly update the model. You can do those sorts of things. The question is, when it comes to morality, whether you would want to or not. And so if you tend to be a centralized system where you believe that you have the best of all possible worlds already, you've already achieved it, right? We just have to achieve this goal. We've got our objective function. We're going to go towards it. Then outside information is only useful to you insofar as it will contribute to the goal that you've already chosen. So in that way, I think a centralized system is much more likely to be unresponsive to the environment, whereas a centralized system, or a decentralized system, sorry, is much more likely to be having different areas, different groups out there experimenting with different ideas, and then eventually looking at these different sources of information, and hopefully that will promote some updating, because one group of people might say, hey, this is not working for us over here, or this is not over here, you got bias in the system, it's giving biased outputs, or your system's not accessible to people who are over in this group. So I think the decentralized system gives better opportunities for updating, I suppose, because there's just a little bit more fuzziness around the way everything operates. Does that kind of get at your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Definitely clarifies. Thank you.
All right, Braden, do we have time for one more?
Yeah, and then you also have a comment in the panelist chat as well, just to point your attention to that.
So let's go with Ron then.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, terrific paper and very thought-provoking. Thank you so much, Brian. I like what you said early on in the paper. I think it's along about page 2 about the way in. Well, you're talking there about QAnon and gullibility and all of that. And then you write this: the steadfast desire to maintain false beliefs in the face of all opposing evidence, et cetera, et cetera. It's the word desire that I want to call attention to. I see that as kind of reaching down below, underneath the question of virtues. I mean, the very first sentence of Aristotle's Ethics. What is it we seek? What is it that people seek? And and I'm wondering, it seems to me you're suggesting, I think you are, that AI, perhaps already, perhaps in the examples of Facebook, et cetera, can actually manipulate human desire. It can make us want stuff that maybe we have a tilt toward wanting, but it can solidify those desires in a, well, let's just say an ominous way that then bears fruit in habits of virtue and vice, but underneath is the desire. But then later on, I think you suggest, I may be reading it wrong, that human beings are free, or should be left free. It's in the context of the China and other kinds of things. So whether AI in fact leaves them free and political forces curtail that freedom, that's not the real issue I'm after here. The question is whether AI can manipulate desire so that people act freely, and yet are not free at all because the desire itself is manipulated. Whether the AI has such persuasiveness that it can manipulate what we want, so we act freely on the basis of what we want, but what we want is itself unfreely bound. Does that make any sense as a question?
Yeah, it does. Because you're exactly right. If YouTube's entire way that they operate is through unarticulated want, recommending things to us, that indicates that they're getting into our subconscious, right? They're trying to get below the conscious level of where our sensation of freedom is existing. And so that manipulation of desire, I think you're exactly right. We should recognize that a lot of these big companies are not operating on the conscious level. They're operating subconsciously below that. And you know, sometimes they say, we know, people say this, we know more about you than you know about yourself. But in this case, they actually do, if they can supply you things that you don't know that you already want. And of course, that's always been Google's objective, which is that you open up the search screen and it already has the results that you're looking for because it just knows that much about you. You know, the suggestions that they give you right now is just supposed to be a stopgap measure before the final of we already know what you want before you want it. And what does freedom even mean when you're in a system like that? I think is really interesting. I don't think I have any sort of answer for what you're asking, other than to say that there's a lot of complexity going on here in terms of the moral psychology of how virtue operates, and vice operates for that matter, because they're really preying upon their kind of have a predatory, you know, way of looking at human beings. They want our time, they want our eyeballs, and in that way, they really want our lives, right? They're taking our life away from us. The only thing we have is our time, and they're turning it into, you know, a few cents on the hour, right? And that's enough for them as long as you have 1 billion users. So in that way, can you get the output to be something other than money, which is being, you know, vampirized for their own good, or our lives being vampirized and turned into money for them? can we turn it into social benefit for society? I think there should be a way to do this, because if we can direct these towards bad, then we should be able to direct them towards something good. But then becomes the whole question of how do we know what's actually good and bad, which is a whole nother section. Now, I know that there are a couple more questions, but I've gone over time. So Braden, I want to turn it back to you.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think we're going to be facing this challenge the entire time. So again, that's why I think that if the general audience has questions, they are hoping to maybe get additional feedback beyond what we might be able to give in the question and answer time. If you use the question and answer box, you can also include an email address, and there's no guarantee that people will get back to you, but we'll be sharing all of that, even questions we don't actively say out loud with the panelists. So with that, I think, thank you, Brian, and we'll move on to our next presentation, which will be from Elias Kruger and Brian Sigmon. Elias Kruger is a Brazilian native currently residing in Atlanta, Georgia, and is the founder of AI Theology, a learning community that explores the intersection of spirituality and AI technology. He's also an advisor for the organization AI and Faith and a board member for the Christian Transhumanist Association. Brian Sigmon is a biblical scholar, science fiction author, and member of the AI Theology Advisory Board. He holds a PhD in religious studies from Marquette University and currently works as an acquisitions editor at the United Methodist Publishing House in Nashville, Tennessee. Let's give our attention to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Braden. All right. So I appreciate the opportunity. This is, as you heard, I come from a slightly different background and don't really attend or been to academic conferences. This is my first one. I'm excited to be here and honored to be invited to speak. This was a very exciting paper that we did, both me and Brian. And we, as you heard, we're coming from different backgrounds, and we wanted to come together to see if we could build something, contribute to the debate around AI and virtue. And we were already working on another project, so it kind of made sense to use some things from there. But I want to maybe turn to Brian, and so he can talk a little bit about how this paper came about. Anyways, we'll just continue, and I'll get Brian to come back in as soon as he's able to. So I'm assuming that everybody read the paper. So what I thought would be a better use of our time for this initial 10 minutes would be to talk a little bit about the process of building this paper. As you can see, it was very unique. So I have here my presentation here to kind of go over, and we're going to talk about 4 different things. As you can imagine, there's different things that we're trying to bring together: a vision for the future, a view about ethics and using a biblical framework, and then getting into the nitty-gritty of technology within a use case for climate refugees. So we were trying to do a lot, and we wish we could have written 60,000 words. But since we couldn't, we're going to talk 10 minutes about how we got there, and that can enrich a little bit more and hopefully answer some questions also about the paper. So let me start talking about AI applications. We wanted to be very concrete about what we meant by AI, and not just the technology itself, but its uses. And so we were very deliberate about what are the actual applications that we're going to focus on, real life applications. As you know, technologies are implied in many ways. They're applied in many different ways, and how they are applied really matters a lot. So we thought, can we look at the specific case here of refugees, and possibly primarily looking at their journey, across borders? What are some technologies that would be specific to them, and specifically that had an AI focus in it? So we didn't want to boil the ocean. So we came up with 4 main areas, 4 main applications that we thought were very relevant. Facial recognition being a top one. As you can, we're starting to see the effects of that and the controversy around bias on facial recognition. So definitely a big one. AI-enabled drones. While drone in itself is not an AI technology, as you can see now, even in the war in the Ukraine, a lot of the drones are being used with AI to help the navigation and make them easier to use. So that way we wanted to put AI-enabled drones here. Chatbots, don't need to say much. Of course, with ChatGPT, everybody knows what that is. And we should be seeing a lot more of those in the next 20 years. And finally, recommendation systems. This would be your Netflix. These are the movies you should watch. And now this is expanding into other business applications, but definitely a big application there. Obviously, this doesn't encompass everything, but encompass some key ones, right? And we asked some questions as we were doing that. So we wanted to make sure it was relevant to climate refugees. We wanted to make sure they had enough AI components. And also, we wanted to see any evidence of plans of existing implementation, right? So it'd be great for us to imagine something, but if we don't have any evidence that, let's say, a government is trying to implement this in a border region, or any company starting to look into that, then we thought, well, let's keep that aside. So we were very, again, circumspect around these and trying to be as plausible as possible, knowing that we are dealing with the future where, it's anybody's game in some ways. And then we also overlay them with our scenarios, which I'll come to next. But basically, the idea was, we know that technologies live within an ecosystem of both regulation, government, ideology, business, who is providing, who is being used. So we wanted to capture the ethos of each scenario and how that technology would be used in that scenario. We also would think about, how far advanced would they be? And, think about all these things. And finally, obviously, political assumptions. What are some of the political assumptions that would be overriding the use of these technologies? So this was, a big kind of part of our thought process in picking those applications and then applying them to the scenarios. So, all right, let me go back to this. So next, I wanted to talk a little bit about the scenarios. We actually had built the scenarios for a book project that we're working on in AI theology, but it turned out that they were actually very relevant to this paper. And we figured that we would use the work that we had done there to kind of create the framework. So what are these scenarios? These scenarios come from, a scenario planning exercise, which is kind of a business discipline, but also in future studies that uses a lot. And the way you go about it is you choose two main variables that are going to define your future. And then you create quadrants for high and low for each scenario, for each of these. So in this case, it's interesting because Brian picked centralization and decentralization. So in our geopolitical axis, that's kind of what we're talking about here. But more specifically, it's kind of nationalism and globalism. How much will countries cooperate with each other, how much more will they compete? And so we have that axis, one being high in cooperation, one being low in cooperation. And on the other, we thought climate change would be really the big driver. And then we were looking at a future where climate change is worse, and then a future where climate change is more mild. And as you can see, the colors kind of give you where they are each. We have top there, national green, which is honestly probably a lot of what's going on today if it just continues. And then there's a focus on national security, nearshoring. Countries are, after COVID, trying to bring things closer to themselves. There's a lot of gridlock in politics and many different areas. But the idea is that there's a competition through nationalism. And if you watch even the landscape today, the move towards industrial policy within the US and Europe, that is already happening. So what if that continues in 20 years? This is kind of the scenario that we're looking at. The next one is kind of our global green one. So this is where the global cooperation and climate change is less worse than it was. So there is this emergence of a global green consciousness, this idea more of eco-regionism, of regions being more dependent on each other as opposed to more of a global, trade idea. Idea of post-humanism, more focused on the environment, not displacing anthropocentrism from our institutions, and then more cooperation through multilateralism. So that is planetary green. Finally, we have the national brown, where countries are both divided and also the climate change is worse. Here we see fundamentalism of all kinds, not just the religious one, realpolitik, this idea of making a way through war, and imposing power, militarization, and competition through war. And finally, we have another one, which would be Pax Negotium. This is kind of the transhumanist dream future of technical capitalism, where we really just double down on technology and create cooperation through commerce. So this is a world run by multinational companies, in short. So for our paper, of course, we were not going to do for all four because that was going to be too long. So we focused primarily on global green and national brown, and that's really for the use cases that we're using on. All right, is Brian back? Hey, there you go, Brian. So
Yes.
This is the part there.
Hi, everyone. I apologize for dropping off. I assure you I was in the middle of saying something incredibly brilliant and insightful that you all unfortunately won't get to hear, but I'll give you this version now. So when we talked about an ethical framework for evaluating the virtue of AI when it comes to vulnerable populations, the Hebrew Bible and the treatment of the Israelite people is what immediately came to mind. There are a couple reasons for this. The biggest one is because displacement and migration characterizes the Israelites' experience throughout the Hebrew Bible. There's the experience of Exodus, where they're residing outside the land. They're residing in the land of Egypt, and then on their way back, they are wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. There's also the analogous experience of exile, where the population is forced to migrate from the land of Judah to Babylon, not by their choice. So there's this posture of being displaced, this posture of living outside the place that they would call home, really characterizes the Israelite people. And so it seemed like a natural starting point for us as we're evaluating the ethical treatment of vulnerable populations. Moreover, God's people, the Israelites, are in fact climate refugees when we think of them entering Egypt for the first time. They, of course, migrate to Egypt at the end of the book of Genesis during a famine that causes their situation to be one where they can't have enough food. They're forced to go move to Egypt in order to have enough food and to survive. So we thought that makes a really good analogy for evaluating the future treatment of climate refugees. Looking at that, two really important postures seem to emerge for us in looking at the story of the Exodus. That's where we decided to focus on in the paper. Number one is self-determination, being who they want to be rather than who the controlling population wants them to be. So for the Israelites in the book of Exodus, that is worshiping God in the wilderness. So they worship God, they serve God instead of Pharaoh. So we describe that as self-determination. And then Sabbath, is existence characterized by one of rest and restoration, or is it characterized by just relentless work, performance to exacting standards on behalf of the nation where they find themselves? One really interesting insight that I found that I think really can shape our use of AI, or thinking of AI, is that in the book of Exodus, God and Pharaoh use similar tools to talk to the Israelite people. So Pharaoh forces the Israelites to build supply cities at the beginning of Exodus, but God also puts the Israelites to work. After setting them free, God sets the Israelites to work building the tabernacle. God gives Moses supernatural signs to convince the Israelites and Pharaoh that God really has sent Moses, such as turning his staff into a serpent, turning the Nile River into blood. But Pharaoh's magicians are also able to do some of the same things. They're able to mimic many of the plagues that God sends against Egypt. Pharaoh used military might in the forms of horses and chariots, but God fights for Israel, and that's described in many times using militaristic terms. And the people celebrate that like a military victory. So there's a big difference in the power that God and Pharaoh wields. It's really presented as no contest. God is overpowering Pharaoh, but the actual tools and means they use are some of the same means. So he said that understanding AI, the actual kind of AI that is used is less important than the manner in which it is used. So virtuous AI is AI used virtuously. So Elias, that's it for me. I'll kick it back over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, fantastic. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about climate refugees. We thought that climate refugees really offer the best population for us to look into. There was a sense of shared responsibility around climate refugees, because if we are not working towards, stopping climate change, then that is, all of our responsibility. There's going to be more of them. So there was this sense of shared global responsibility that really made it for a good kind of test case. Before we go to the discussion, I just want to put in some numbers out there, because I think, hopefully that's something that you can stay with you if you don't remember anything about this presentation, but just some interesting factoids about climate refugees. So right now we are at 22 million. The estimation of how many climate refugees are out there, at this point in history. It's a significant number, very, very small compared to, of course, the world population, but that's still 22 million, a very large number, larger than many countries. The second number, which is really more sobering, is this one, 2.2 billion. And that is the number of people that will live in the 40 most at-risk countries in 2050. And the reason for that is most at risk of climate disaster, whether it is through heat, through famine, through floods. And, we don't know how many of those will become refugees, but just to think that 22.2 billion will be in lands that are very fragile, not just from a climate perspective, from a political perspective, that is something that should cause us pause. And then with that all said, while this is a tremendous challenge, there is also tremendous opportunity here. And I hope that in the paper that comes through, which is this idea that decisive climate action now could prevent 4 out of 5 projected migrants from leaving their home in the next 3 decades. I think that in itself should really be an incentive for us to work in many ways, and primarily, especially in this case, for AI, to use AI in ways that can empower those refugees, and first to prevent from them even having to go, but then eventually to empower them to become free and be able to find the opportunities that they need. So that's really our presentation for today. I wanted to back to Braden and see if there's questions.
Oh, yeah, Greg's got his hand raised there. Go ahead.
Yeah, so this is more just, I think, a comment or a suggestion. So among the possible roles you imagine for AI with respect to climate refugees, which I think it's a very interesting application you're thinking about. One I might add to your consideration is the role that AI-powered modeling of climate refugee patterns might play in policy making. And of course, it might be used both positively and negatively, right? So modeling of patterns of refugee flow over the next decades might be used for the purpose of simply, keeping potential climate refugees where they are, or they might be used to actually address the needs of climate refugees in the face of climate change. So that's just one I might add to your consideration. But thanks much. It's very interesting to see that application for this topic.
Yeah, no, Greg, thanks for pointing that out. We kind of addressed that in a subside through recommendation systems. And if there's a part in the paper where we talk about the green regen. There is this idea of governments kind of using those models to actually predict and make provision for it, and actually create opportunity cities for refugees to come and be able to be served that way. So yeah, definitely a big part, and on climate change disaster. So that's but yeah, appreciate the point there.
Yeah, thanks. Just a quick question, because in the title you evoke the issue of poverty, right? But there's not a whole lot of economic analysis going on in the paper. So climate refugees sort of seems to end up functioning as a stand-in for the poor. And that's a little bit complicated, because not everyone who becomes a climate refugee is in fact poor. obviously there's many issues of disproportionate impact, but I'm wondering how that might factor into your analysis here, because I didn't see it addressed directly in the paper. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, in part, it was kind of trying to find a vulnerable population that we could do a very limited use case on. I think to prove out whether AI will oppress or empower the poor in general would require a wider analysis, which is definitely something to think about and as a next step here, to maybe go beyond just climate refugees. So definitely interesting comment and suggestion there. I know, Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just jump in to answer that too. I think when we started writing our paper, or when we started proposing the paper, we started and realized the scope of what we were trying to address. So we had to narrow that down. And so climate refugees really seemed like the right place to do that. But you're absolutely right. There's a whole lot of things that we are not covering because we had to narrow our focus a little bit.
Additional questions or comments or suggestions? I mean, we're always open to hearing anything that maybe we didn't about. I think Lawrence brought one thing, anything that we didn't address that maybe you would have liked to see addressed.
If I can ask a question, if we've got a couple minutes,
Sure.
I would love to hear from the panel. We identified climate change and global cooperation or lack of cooperation as two of the biggest drivers. I've been curious from the outset, do those seem like the right ones to isolate? What other ones would you lift up besides that? If we were to add a third factor to our matrix, what would you add to that?
Shannon, go ahead.
Shannon's hand up.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, first, I think you've chosen well. I mean, I think those are two very important drivers. So I'm not actually, I guess, advocating for adding a third one. But if you did want to, something that is obviously related to the first two, as you well know and have noted, is going to be conflict. Just more war and conflict, because of course the displacement of persons and the pressures of environmental damage drive people into fresh conflicts. So as well as exacerbating existing conflict. So I mean, I don't know if you want to separate that or just make it a nuance of the other two, but specifically, obviously, I'm talking about armed conflict. Might be violence, might be relevant.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When we were looking at climate refugees, there is really amplifying effect, right? So if let's say there's a climate disaster in an area that is politically unstable, sometimes people will not flee because of the climate, but because of the political instability that creates wars that then drives them out. So those things are very much interrelated, and definitely a very important driver. And in this case, it's kind of like which one comes first. We don't know, so. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And I'll only add, in case it's helpful, that I've greatly admired the work of Farouk El-Baz, who has tried to draw attention to the fact that a lot of the conflict in Darfur has been driven by lack of access to water resources. And so he was trying to address that through that means in an intriguing way. So trying to say what we need to do is tap into that. There's apparently a reservoir the size of Lake Erie under this contested land. And if we could bring up that water, would it dissolve these other conflicts? So just as an example, that might be something you could throw in there. His work certainly would show how these points that you're highlighting interconnect nicely.
Yeah, definitely. Cyrus, thanks, Shannon.
Yeah, thank you, Elias and Brian and colleagues. I just wanted to ask and maybe relate some of this content to what I know has been happening in some refugee camps in northern Uganda. So some colleagues who teach at Makerere University were involved in a Play Foundation grant to study play education in refugee camps in northern Uganda. And I'm curious if you both have explored partnerships with any groups or organizations where you can actually include the voices of refugees in data sets and training in language models, and if there's any need on your part to find those kinds of partnerships to enrich what you're saying in the content for AI and refugees.
Yeah, no, I think that would be a great follow-up. I've actually looked up technology uses to help to empower refugees, and I've seen that there's some apps being created to help them out. But yeah, definitely adding the data sets. I think it's a great follow-up. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for your presentation. So following the title, will AI oppress or empower the poor? Are you in any way suggesting that AI can bear moral responsibility and moral agency? So if AI is empowering or oppressing the poor in the context of your paper, who is the moral agent, and then who bears the moral responsibility? So I'm kind of asking, what this title, what does it suggest in terms of the moral responsibility and agency of oppression or empowering the poor?
I'll jump in with an answer. Thanks so much for the question. I just wrote a big note to myself. We probably need to retitle this because I would say, and Elias can speak for himself, but my answer to that would be that AI would not be the moral agent. It would be a tool that, so I think a better title would be, will AI be used to empower the poor or oppress, right? So I would absolutely locate the moral agent as humans who are using AI.
All right, great response.
I don't know if Elias would differ.
No, that's exactly. I think that's exactly where we were right. I think we started in the title with that question, but I think inevitably the way that we did the analysis was really about open future. Things can go a certain way, and it's really all going to depend on the ecosystem around those technologies. So the moral agency, I would say it's shared among humanity, among kind of a global community. That's maybe the way that I would characterize it.
Super quick.
Oh, just to say that it's a question of whether your paper falls into question 1 or question 3. In making it the agent of morality makes it question 1. Making it the agent itself makes it question 3. So I think the way you change your title puts it back into question 1 where I think it belongs. Thanks.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. So unfortunately, we need to move on to our next presentation time-wise, but I am excited that we get to hear from Greg Peterson. Dr. Peterson is professor of philosophy and religion and director of the ethics lab at South Dakota State University. I've met Greg through a number of other things, so I'm delighted to hear from him in this context. So we're going to hear about democratic AI and democratic virtues and institutions.
As with the others, I'll just be giving an overview of my paper. Elements of this are tapping into some other projects I'm working on, but applying some of this framework to AI for me is new. So just a little bit of background. So when I talk about virtues and virtuous institutions, I'm using or developing a specific framework. So when we talk about virtues, there's a number of ways we can talk about those nowadays. So Brian's talk earlier, he very much tapped into Aristotle. And that would be certainly some of that Aristotelian language would be behind the framework that I'm working out of as well. So virtues, as I understand it at the individual level, are plural. They're character traits, or what I might call active dispositions. And I mention that just to kind of distinguish that from a kind of global use of virtue, that we sometimes use virtue as a kind of assessment of character as a whole. So some people use the term that way. The model that I've been working on with colleagues over some years is what I've come to call the heist model in recent work. So composed of psychologically speaking, harmonic processing between explicit and implicit layers of cognition, emotion laden, identity connected, and employing what we might call active schema. So I can unpack that if desired, but that's just a kind of reference point to make clear what I'm talking about. And then also I would emphasize that when I'm talking about virtues, I don't think of virtues as perfections necessarily. So that would be one way that the way I think about virtues maybe distinguishes from the Aristotelian tradition. But they're just positive, yet typically or perhaps always imperfectly developed character traits. So within that framework, we might talk about democratic virtues. I list some in that little left blue panel there that would be possible candidates. And a democratic virtue just is a moral or epistemic virtue that plays some causal role in the functioning of democratic institutions. And then when we talk about virtuous institutions, for present purposes, that's just a kind of metaphorical language. So we might talk about, as John Rawls does, justice as being the first virtue of an institution. And we might attribute other virtues metaphorically as well. The little kind of graphic down in the left corner there kind of illustrates some of the causal roles. So we have the individual with maybe putative virtues that are politically active, so perhaps in protest, but in voting or other ways as well, which influence civic institutions. But those civic institutions, along with other institutions such as family and religion, education, influence the individual and development of virtues as well. So when we talk about the role that AI might have in virtue formation, and to at least try to think about that positively, in the paper, I conjecture three kind of ways that AI might play some positive role in virtue formation, and also some of the more obvious problems with each of those roles. So one very kind of basic role that AI might play in a positive way is by protecting us as consumers or just as citizens from various sorts of malign AI-powered technology. So if we think about some of the sorts that Brian talked about in his first talk, so if we think of YouTube algorithms as a danger, so AI is powering that kind of technology, but we might also develop AI tools to kind of protect us from those kind of algorithms. And so here I appeal a little bit to the notion of evolutionary arms race, which is something we see very obviously in the history of computers as well, and computer viruses. And so the story of computers is in part the story of the evolution of computer viruses and the evolution of security systems to combat computer viruses and other sort of malign uses of software. Now, one feature of this kind of usage of AI, we might decide maybe just to unplug altogether. We have kind of various forms of that movement currently with folks maybe just ditching their smartphones or ditching social media. And while that's certainly a possibility, there's probably for most of us significant limits on that. If we unplug, that doesn't mean that the rest of society unplugs. And if we're going to engage with the rest of society, then at some level we have to be engaged with AI-powered tools if those still exist, and then have to cope with that. So that's a kind of elementary level. I consider possibilities of the role for AI in enhancing virtue or virtue formation or virtue development. So one or two kind of more obvious ways that this might occur is through the developments of certain kind of apps. So think of apps broadly. So we think of apps as something that's on your phone. We might think of app as any kind of software implementation that can be on multiple devices or media. Certainly it's not hard to imagine that folks might desire to develop apps, and we see this already, that develop character traits and maybe specific virtuous traits. Or more speculatively, and this gets into kind of the transhumanist literature, we might imagine the role that AI-enabled implants into the brain might play a role in complementing the development of virtues. For instance, by modulating the emotional reactivity of specific emotions. So those are logical possibilities. So I won't get into the kind of technical issues, particularly with implants. I'm just kind of considering the possibility there. And there I just kind of note some important issues that come up with those two kinds of enhancement models. So with respect to the apps in particular, there's a kind of obvious truth and advertising issue. So there's all sorts of people promoting all sorts of ideas, figuring out who actually has true virtue as opposed to just selling something is already a significant problem, and we might actually imagine that magnifying. But there's also a kind of basic problem of just having sufficient knowledge of a virtue's developmental path in order to create a technology, whether it's an app or an implant, to be successful in contributing to virtue formation. And so that seems to be a rather significant problem. So if you don't have really genuine knowledge of virtue formation, no app or implant is actually going to be successful. And then there's a third layer, which is perhaps even more intractable, is that when we look at virtue formation, there's good reason to think that virtue formation is social in character, that virtue formation occurs in the context of communities of which one is a part. And that's not something that can be addressed by individual level applications. So those are significant barriers to kind of the individual enhancement model. So it's not to say that there can't be some role for AI development there, but there's likely some limits. The last one that I consider is what I call the modeling model. And so this is just using the power of AI and what we know of biology of the brain, including of the brain, but also maybe of social dynamics as well, to model virtue formation and then use that modeling to help aid virtue formation. So as AI grows in power, that seems plausible that there would be contributions there. So there's some challenges in terms of like the complexity of the brain and also social complexity. But you might imagine that AI could make some contributions, even if they don't, even if they're limited in important ways. Now, in the modeling model, this is one area where black box problems come in. So we might have an AI model that works as far as we can tell, but because of its complexity, we won't necessarily know why it works. We don't know what's going on inside the black box, assuming it's a black box AI model. But there's also, we might say, a kind of double black box problem when we're talking about virtue formation. that because the biology is so complex, there's not really a way we could really check against the black box model against the actual biology. So that's a kind of problem there. And in addition, when we talk about modeling, there are these worries about dual use applications. So on the one hand, we might use virtue formation modeling to promote virtue formation. We might also use it to prevent virtue formation. And we can easily imagine agents who would want to do that as well. So in the paper, so those are kind of individual virtue issues. So modeling, developing a way that AI can help or hinder individual virtue formation. We can also think about this at the institutional level. So I'll spend a little bit less time here, I think. But we might note again, there's kind of different ways that this can occur. So AI might enhance human agents, say in government agencies, by automating certain aspects of decision making. So enabling faster, more sophisticated cost benefit analysis and impacts of budget proposals and so forth. There are some folks who have advocated various forms of replacement. So I talked about this in the paper a little bit, where instead of having human representatives, we might have just vote for AI algorithms that implement our particular preferences. This seems, admittedly, to me a little bit fanciful, but we can note that these are actual proposals that are being put out there by people thinking about these sorts of issues. And as with the individual modeling, we can also have institutional modeling. So just as we might model individual virtue formation, we can also model institution formation. And we can maybe do this in ways that can be very useful for a particular country going through a transition. So that's something that occurs at the institutional level as well. So in the paper, I note some of the issues again with each of these. So again, there's some black box issues, particularly with the institutional modeling. There's also some very important issues of what generally counts as good governance and democracy, good democratic governance. And so if we're replacing representatives or even to some degree citizens by having our AI representatives representing our actions for us, that brings up the question whether we're still really being a democracy and engaging in human shared formation of policy choices for the community. So I'll just kind of note those issues. I conclude the paper with these considerations then of the role of rule of law in thinking about advancing AI. So, thinking back to the 1990s, so some of you who were around during that time, might remember how prominent the slogan "information wants to be free" was, in the sort of language of the marketplace of ideas that we shouldn't have government regulation in the internet because that's just going to prevent innovation and so forth. And of course, what we've seen obviously are some very, very good things, but we've also now seen the nasty side of that. And so what we get in the absence of coordination is what we might call the digital state of nature. So in the paper at the end, I make this argument for a role for rule of law in the context of AI, and the argument that even when we talk about markets themselves are constituted by rule of law. And so we can think of this at a couple levels. So in terms of just regulation, on the one hand, regulation we might think of impeding development, but we can also think of regulation as enabling development as well. that by setting kind of basic ground rules of how markets are to develop and operate, we can enable those markets to develop in healthy ways rather than unhealthy ways. The problem with something like AI, but not only AI, is that there's an obvious kind of free rider problem. So if we only have regulation at the national level, what we then can get are states who have less restrictions that enable nastier forms of AI development. So this is a form of the free rider problem. We see this already with things like ransomware, where prosecution can be difficult if or not impossible if the people running the ransomware operations are in a country outside of jurisdiction. And so what we really need then to kind of grapple with a kind of healthy form of AI development is international collaboration and international norms, not just national norms. And part of that means, or an element of that involves the idea of enforceability. So one thing we can see, I think, in the kind of recent history of kind of advocating codes of ethics is they have limits. If they're just corporate codes of ethics, it's easy to dump them, as occurred in the case of GPT and Microsoft, where they found having an ethics board was inconvenient when things started to get very hot. But also in terms of what's actually proposed at national and international level. So we need something more than codes of ethics. We need agreed norms that are backed by rule of law. So that's the paper in a nutshell. So I'll leave it at that and open it to questions.
Yeah, I'll start. Thanks, Greg. I thought that was a great talk. One question I have, which is kind of an expansion of what you were first saying at the end. I mean, you mentioned several places where it seems like something has succeeded, like with the meeting of geneticists in the outer space treaty to prevent killer weapons. And I'm just curious about like there's certainly like one question is like, what kind of regulation do you think there might be kind of a global consensus of? But kind of barring that, I mean, is there a way you think that, a large government like the US or the EU could kind of lead something that that others would just kind of buy into? I'm kind of thinking about with like the EU and some of the privacy restrictions that for a lot of companies, it was easier to just kind of buy into some of the EU privacy restrictions rather than go through all the complexity of trying to figure out where all the users were, all the servers were, et cetera. And so it was kind of a low enough bar to adhere to the EU, some of the EU privacy, that's just what companies ended up doing. I wondered if you had any thoughts about what might work in that space.
Yeah, so I don't admittedly have a lot that's specific at this point, and it's, I think, moving very fast. So it's hard to be very specific, and likely will have to kind of evolve, but maybe not take too long given the pace of change. So just an example of the sort of idea of AI fingerprinting with regard to technologies like ChatGPT and generative AI, where we might be able to fingerprint systems. So that might work. We might require that as a matter of law, so that AI systems are identified as AI systems, and we have fingerprinting technology that can identify them even in absence of identification. But if the technology changes, then it becomes that fingerprinting might just go by the wayside, and we might have to resort to something else. So that so there are kind of at this point, both the U.S. and UN, and also most notably EU, are kind of working on various sorts of proposals. And I'm admittedly rather pessimistic on actually getting international agreement. So, you know, I think the EU is an interesting case just because of the size. If they have this outsized influence on companies, even in the United States. So that can still do a lot of work, even if we don't have complete international agreement. But in the absence of international agreement, what we have then is something like what we have with the current environment with respect to viruses and ransomware and so forth, where we have maybe better regulation in some countries that kind of dampen the ability of malevolent actors. But if they're operating in, say, North Korea, it's much harder to deal with that. Thanks, Mark. Thomas has his hand up.
Great, thank you. Thanks for this contribution. I had a question about the AI agents, as you probably anticipated in the latter half of your talk, around them replacing certain institutional agencies or certain, you know, having a kind of agent's role. And I just, I think it was an implicit, you talked about the black box problem, but it seems that what might also fall out from your analysis, I just wanted to see if you would agree, is that any role for that agency where preferences or preferences are presented back to the public in such a way that they you know, have no auditing or have no independent checking, means that the difference between the preferences I can convince you are your true preferences versus the preferences that are actually your true preferences collapses. And it gets to, I think, on Brian's talk about unarticulated want. If I can convince you that you want it, and I can, you know, your behavior conforms to it, then it seems to me that that agent can then collapse that difference. So so it's not just the black box problem of how it's deciding, it's just what the effective function of it is. Just wanted to see what you thought about that.
Yeah, actually, could you just say a bit more? So the beginning of your question, I understood to be asking about these things like having algorithms as our representatives. Is that right?
Right. So what kind? It just seems that representative role seems really important to, you know, if you're saying there's a calculation that can be made on a budget item or something like that, that's one thing. But presenting back public preferences or public ideas or, you know, public judgments about something, that just seems to be a whole different level of risk.
Yeah, so to be fair, so as I indicated, I mean, I'm skeptical of this, mainly on other grounds that I think it kind of usurps really what democracy is about. But to give to make sure I'm kind of presenting the ideas fairly, as proposed by Burgess. So the idea is that the algorithms we would elect would be transparent, so they wouldn't be black boxes. We would know how they work, and so then we could be presumably reliably predictive. The problem there, of course, is that the easier they are to understand, the less able they are to do. And so if we want artificial agents that are capable of complex negotiation, then that's increasingly likely that that's going to be a kind of artificial agent that's going to be opaque, at least to the ordinary person, and perhaps even to experts. So there, you know, the choice, I think, increasingly would be an artificial representative that is not going to be fully functional, or one that's going to be, we might say, closer to fully functional, whatever that would mean, but increasingly opaque, to our understanding of what it's actually doing, which would then, I think, lead to the concerns that you're raising. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, Gregory. Lots of very, very interesting stuff, actually. I guess my question, or actually before the question, I think one of the really insightful things that you said, amongst many, was to balance the discourse, balance the concern with using regulation as a means of dampening innovation, and saying that how sometimes this can funnel social productive output, through regulation. I thought that was very well made. But I guess the concern, though, and thinking from an EU context, where the development of, I remember on the launch of the EU's white paper and system of human-centric regulation for AI, they're talking about human-centric regulation. So how are we going to develop human-centric AI is through rules. So there's a jump between talk of virtue towards a talk of rules. And I wonder whether there's enough theoretical discussion of how virtue relates to rules. So in your paper, you were thinking about how virtues may develop as a result of the rules or the absence of the rules. Okay, so how regulation can impact, either facilitate or dampen virtues amongst users of AIs and developments of AI. But is it takes us to the teleos of the rules, right? Or at least I started thinking about the teleos of the rules. So when we're looking at the race to regulation, or in the UK context, the race to minimal regulation is quite clearly for economic imperatives, right? So there's a tension there, okay? And actually, do we need a theory of law, or more explicitly a practice of rule of law, which is also concerned with virtue? Right? So often these things are separated. I don't know if I'm making any sense here, right? So our theory, so we talk about a rule of law, but what's the teleos of the law? Okay, is it for maintaining the state? Is it for maintaining differentiate? Is it for maintaining order? Okay, in the state of nature. Okay, or is there the possibility for a theory of law which is actually directed to the cultivation of virtue, so that law becomes instrumental towards virtue? So, for me, at least, a Muslim reading of the Aristotelian discourse positioned law, or in terms of Sharia law anyway, as being instrumental, okay, towards virtue. So I don't know whether that's something that you've been thinking about, or you could share some thoughts on.
Yes, so that's admittedly, so that's something I did not develop in the paper, but something I've been working on. So I'm working on a manuscript tentatively titled Just Virtues, working on the relation of a kind of virtue framework to the idea of institutional justice. And so the position I'm working on is that when we talk about we might call the content of virtues and the content of justice, we might cash that out in terms of or might think of that in terms of objective goods. So I'm appealing to something that's called an objective list theory. It's in some ways we might call a kind of update of natural law. But it's also, the capabilities approach of Martha Nussbaum is a kind of a near neighbor of this, where there's a kind of, basic goods like life and health, and maybe cognitive emotional well-being that we aim at. And then law, I see as in no small part a solution for coordination problems. Also free rider problems, but I emphasize coordination problems. So when we act jointly, even if we're all well-intentioned actors, there can be unintended externalities from our actions if we're not coordinating. So the rule of law is necessary to enable access to goods that we wouldn't have if we were just all acting singly, right? So rule of law is very important, I think, for coordination, for acting together. And that context of rule of law is feeds back into virtue formation and is also fed into by the character traits of the citizenry, of the people who are governed within that system. So I very much see that as kind of central to what I'm doing. And so that rule of law, we want to get right? So if the rule of law is simply enabling exploiters to exploit the exploited, that's not a just system, right? So what we want is a just rule of law, not an unjust one that creates significant objective harms. So I think that's what answers what you're getting at, but if not, you can let me know.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We're running about a few minutes behind, but I want to make sure everybody's getting their due time. So I think we're ready to move on to our next presentation, which is Michael Paulus, who is the Dean of the Library, Assistant Provost for Educational Technology, and Associate Professor of Information Studies at Seattle Pacific University. And we'll be hearing about libraries as institutions and their relationship with AI. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you to the conference organizers and to all of you who are participating. It's really an honor to be part of this conversation. And I'm going to jump into, there's a lot of different ways of kind of describing, what we're experiencing at this particular moment in time with, technologies of artificial intelligence. And one of the terms that's used to describe this is the information revolution. It's a term that the philosopher Luciano Fleury chooses and uses. And what he says is kind of central to what we're dealing with here, trying to wrap our minds around, is that smart and autonomous agents no longer need to be human. And in my paper, I'm interested in exploring the question to what extent are artificial agents, artificial agency new things for us? Do we have other sort of phenomena that we can draw from in history to think about how we manage artificial agency? And if we do, are there institutions that we can learn from? So maybe a helpful starting point is Hugh of St. Victor in the 12th century distinguished or articulated how human artifacts are a product of human agency that's distinct from divine agencies, distinct from natural agency. Now, Hugh was interested in medieval technologies, things like commerce and medicine, but he saw that human artificial creations had a role in God's creation, had a role in new creation, and was interested in how these tools, these artificial creations, could be used for good. And that is, these technologies in the medieval era drew from more ancient technologies and arguably technologies that we could describe as artificial agents or forms of artificial agency. One of the most significant of these is the city. Of course, cities emerged, thousands of years ago to realize complex and shared goals. And as they aggregated human attention and agency through systems and structures and so forth, they created structural forms of agency that could begin to sort of move things beyond us. This is something that Lowell saw and articulated very clearly in his sociological work in the Technological Society, but even more in his theological work in The Meaning of the City. He uses language to describe the city. It makes it seem like it's this rogue form of AI. He says, these are artificial creations, these environments that we create. They take on a form of autonomy and actually, overpower us and come up with their own goals that drive us, and we become sort of captive to them. And therefore, he sees this as adversarial systems. Now, unlike Hugh, Lowell sees this as not part of God's creation or new creation. these are counter creations. These are the complex technological complexity signified by the city, and also in the city itself as a reality is something that has overpowered us and must be wiped out, eliminated by God, and replaced by God at the end of time. Now, one of the sources that the Lul draws from, of course, is the last book in the Bible, the Apocalypse of John. And in this, you do see a city that's evil, ambiguously so, manifested, as a manifestation of the Roman Empire in the first century. And this is a city that's clearly, and all the technology is connected with it, is clearly judged as doomed and falling, and will be destroyed. But at the same time, you also see this other spiritual city, New Jerusalem. And New Jerusalem is a city, and so instead of the city being annihilated, you see the city being amplified, and you see the holy city of God, and it's the arriving city that's overpowering Babylon, and permeating along with the falling city of Babylon in all the cities to which the book is addressed in the first century. You see the presence of these two spiritual cities, one falling, one arriving, and the call to the churches and the cities is to sort of align their agency with the arriving New Jerusalem, and how the works they do can be aligned with that. So if the city isn't only evil, but there are ways of actually sort of directing the agency of the city to better ends, then the next question could be, well, what are examples of how that's been done, how technologies of human civilization, forms of ancient artificial agency are aligned toward a better end? And so here is where I turn to the institution of the library, which emerged within cities as part of the kind of the structural agency to support what cities do and how they function over time. And in the ancient world, you do see books as these agents of revelation. They have this kind of independent agency. And as books are created and collected into libraries, there's a belief that these earthly libraries are connected with heavenly libraries. And so the divine agency is sort of permeating humans, but it's also working through these books and libraries. And so libraries become kind of like the city, this semi-autonomous kind of artificial system that is aggregating human attention and information agency, toward some end that's meant to. It can be directed in a more positive way. Now, I want to kind of clarify what I mean by library here, because when most of us think of libraries, we think of collections, we think of the stuff that's in the libraries, which is certainly an important part of what libraries are, but it's preceded by an intention to actually build that collection, to say we want to perpetuate, we want to sort of advance our social order, our cultural order through fixed representations of knowledge. And so that leads to a library being established, and then the library then collects texts that are judged worthy of information. But there's a third dimension to libraries, which has to do with information practices. So what are what's necessary, not just to access the materials, but how to use those materials effectively to sort of support the purposes of the library and then its supporting community. And this third dimension of what a library is something that becomes increasingly more complex as technologies become more complex. So this is a definition of the library, I would argue, that was consistent, consistently describes libraries in antiquity, but also into the present. So if we jump ahead a couple millennia, you can see that libraries have been involved with technologies of automation for a number of decades here, starting with kind of more technical operations around cataloging and such, but then building out new systems, new ways of automating discovery and retrieval of information, building out access to digital resources. But during the 21st century, what's become increasingly important within libraries is the notion of how to actually use resources well and effectively. And this is the concept or the practice of information literacy. And so over time, information literacy has broadened to include a set of practices that involve reflecting on information needs, accessing the information that's needed, critically analyzing the information, and then using it ethically. And as technology has become increasingly complex and integrated into information resources, we see that information literacy, approach to information literacy, being brought in to include digital literacies, digital ethics, and now you see libraries leading a lot of the discussions that are happening on campuses around AI literacy. So libraries are developing material technologies and using material technologies to advance access and use of information. They are at the same time, and increasingly more so within the last 20 or 30 years, cultivating formative information practices along with the development of those technologies. So the library, I argue, has, with both old and new forms of artificial agency, provided a model for how we can improve our information environment. Now, what the library is doing, and this goes back to the first dimension of the library, is it has to do with the intention of the library. Why does a library exist? These are informed by community and professional values that determine or influence how what information artifacts are collected, how you cultivate formative information practices to use those, and then how we develop, and this is an important point, infrastructures that are human focused and human scaled. And so the human is really central in terms of how the library functions, which isn't the case with a lot of the interfaces that we deal with in terms of our current information environment. And that the centrality of humans in the design of the library, both in terms of its material technology and its formative practices, enables it to prioritize human values and hopes. And so that's a summary of my paper. Now, what I guess I'm happy to answer questions about that. I guess the point that I've been thinking about after submitting the paper and then sort of reading the other papers and thinking about it is sort of what is the next step. So you can talk about managing the information environment in terms of resources and sort of cultivating how we interact with it. But then there's another step or two at least to get to talking about virtues connected with information. I work at a faith-based institution, so we actually make that move to connect information practices, which themselves are formative, but to actually connect these more intentional with virtue would be sort of a second, an expansion of this paper, if not perhaps on another paper. So if you have thoughts about that, I would be interested in hearing that, as well as answering your questions. But thank you.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for your paper. Really sort of stimulated some thought here of like, how do we connect cultural evolution of AI and how do we sort of approach that and the role of libraries in there? Really, really interesting. I'm curious though, because at the end you said there was a line in there where you said that libraries are leading some of this charge towards information literacy on campus. I'm wondering if you've considered how much or the role of sort of non-campus libraries, I guess, and whether or not it's doing the same role for broader society, right? Public libraries and whatnot. And whether it's being as effective or whether or not we are creating a little bit, it's actually contributing to the digital divide, right? In that information literacy becomes the purview of college educated people. In a way that public libraries don't have the same capacity or are, and I'm curious from your perspective whether or not sort of how we're thinking about this in the broader space, because it definitely cued some things for me of like libraries are a really powerful tool here, but and then answer the but, right?
No, I thank you. I appreciate the question, and I do now it's hard. it's hard to speak about all libraries generally because while there's some similarities across all libraries, different libraries have capacity to different things. So I actually am live in Seattle, so we have a very very good public library system here, and it actually is doing a lot of things comparable to what academic libraries are doing, and so they have a number of public facing programs to address the digital divide. And the digital divide, as you say, it's about access, but it's also about literacy. And I always, when I talk about this, I always say it's also a bit of wisdom too. So it's, there's sort of multiple dimensions to that digital divide, and at their best, a lot of libraries are really trying to embrace that whole range of issues so that you can be a full digital participant in in our society. So yes, public libraries are doing a lot of really interesting and good work in that area, especially those that have the capacity to do so. And I think it is a very positive example of how people can be empowered for fuller inclusion and participation.
Yeah, thanks so much for a really fascinating paper. Wearing my historian hat, I was just I thought the analogy between libraries and artificial intelligence was really quite brilliant and really well laid out in the paper. So thank you for that. I did want to kind of invite you to the sort of prompt you gave us at the end about sort of what are the ethical implications here. And one of the things I thought about is that, in a sense, in one of the differences between artificial intelligence and libraries is that artificial intelligence kind of takes on the librarian role, right? In a sense. So I wonder if thinking about professional ethics among librarians and how librarians think of themselves as moral agents might be a helpful way to draw that connection between in bridging that metaphor in specifically in thinking about the ethical implications.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. I appreciate the question. One of the category mistakes that we see made quite often is to sort of substitute like a chat bot for a reference librarian. And so now I understand that certain chat bots can answer questions very well, and there may be some sort of minimal level of ask us more, if there are any these days, ask any straightforward question and you might be able to get, an AI sort of pulling from a database of answers or something. But we often, if you look at how sort of the critiques around a lot of the GPTs right now, you start to get the sense that, okay, these can maybe help you form questions or sort of do some information retrieval, but at some point you're going to want to probably put some of your own analysis into it and have a slightly more intelligent conversation partner or guide. So I do think there is a role for GPTs. You could imagine a well-constructed GPT as sort of a partner in the research process, but maybe not a complete substitute for someone who can kind of help you clarify your question and maybe sort of get you in a direction where you can actually find the better answers for yourself. But when we do the other part of your question that I picked up on was as we do interact with people who are using AI, whether it's GPT or something even more basic like a recommendation engine, the challenge is to sort of ask the question of responsibility. It's like, you're a user, you have some responsibility. The designers who create this stuff, they have a certain responsibility, and to sort of be critical about how you're interacting with the source of information, how you're using that information. So there's actually, I think, a lot of different points of intervention that within the research process. And again, I'm using that term broadly because it could be someone engaging with a public librarian or someone engaging in an academic context. But there is a lot of different interventions where you do want to have kind of critical distance from whatever resource you're engaging with, and being able to kind of critique that and then use it appropriately. Did that sort of get at everything that was in your question?
Yeah, no, I think I guess I'm also wondering about, as we're thinking about constructing better, whether it's chat interfaces or recommendation algorithms, what are the ethical, what are the virtues, right, of librarians that we should be thinking about building into those, not in a sort of replacement kind of way necessarily, not the but as we think about the ethic, trying to think about these things as ethical, having an ethical dimension.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Maybe I'll go. It's a similar.
Oh yeah, please.
Anyway, similar line of thought to Lawrence's. So I really appreciate the way you positioned the library and emphasize the intention to configure and represent cultural ordering and so on and so forth. And there's intent even in in thinking about this, configuring and representing of culture. There's intention, selection, and mediation on the part of the library and the librarian, right? So I wanted you to see if you wanted to go a little bit further in contrasting it. You called it a category mistake, but in contrasting it to the use of GPT models, actually, right? Where what we're seeing is no intention, actually. Oh, but there of course there is intention, but it's not selective intention, right? In scraping this mass amount of information,
right.
And it's very different. There's no selection here, actually. Okay, and so what have we got in what's the mediation? The mediation is pure probability, right?
Right.
So we've got a completely different way of curating information, which seems to me to actually be polar opposite to the characteristics you highlighted were features of the library, right? So yeah, I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really it's a good observation because as I've played with a lot of these models, there's the general, it's trying like all knowledge, and those end up being the least helpful or interesting. Not to say that there couldn't be a place for that. The Wikipedia would kind of be the analog, but the models that I've played with that have been helpful are the ones that are much more sort of domain specific. So they're sort of trained on kind of a limited domain of knowledge, and then sort of tweaked to work well with that, and that's where you start, I think, getting more interesting results, because it's bounded, it's constrained. So I think that the challenge is, if you wanted to do everything, all knowledge, that's going to be a harder challenge, and maybe that you could imagine a lot of different kind of libraries that would sort of feed that and maybe help it. But if you're focusing on a specific domain, then it's going to be a lot easier to to curate that, and then that would be more like kind of a disciplinary resource you would use in a library context. Now, how libraries sort of intersect with all those overlapping models is an interesting question. I think that, like with anything else, libraries will probably kind of selectively point to ones that have proven to be helpful for members of its community, or whether that's sort of academic community or public. Yeah, Elias.
Hey, Michael, great paper. I really like how you highlighted the importance of institutions, especially of libraries. And I like where you sit, not just as a thinker, but as a practitioner, literally in a university library. And without putting you on the spot here, I'm just wondering, what is Seattle Pacific and the university library doing to kind of build this more, Alexandrian future with AI? What are some applications that, as much as you can share, are they thinking about using to enhance or improve the quality of teaching or of research within the university?
Yeah, I mean, I think like every other academic library, we're doing a lot of conversations right now with students and faculty about educating them about AI. That's been part of what we've done well, since I've been there, we've always sort of brought in kind of digital literacy, for both for students and kind of digital pedagogy and scholarship for faculty. And so with AI over the last few years, we just been bringing that into both the information literacy instruction we do with students and the faculty development we do with faculty. We were actually working on looking at AI writing aids near the end of last year, right before GPT-3 was released. So we went from having a small handful of faculty who were kind of curious how this would change how we taught things like writing, to having almost people from pretty much every discipline interested in sort of attending a workshop, understanding how these tools work and how students were using them and such. So that all is pretty nascent still. We're still kind of working with the models, trying to learn more about the models. And then, finding ways to kind of bring some literacy about those to both faculty and students. The larger systems, in terms of the AI systems themselves, those also are pretty nascent, and AI has been in our systems for a long time, but now I think we're going to start seeing in a pretty short period of time a lot more of that going into our kind of the general library systems we use.
Great, thank you very much.
Right.
So I think we'll transition to our general question and answer time, and that hopefully we can hear from questions from attendees on the Zoom call, but also as we're getting to that point, if we want to have any generative conversation amongst papers that we've already heard thus far, this would be a time to engage in that kind of conversation as well. Well, I guess I'll jump to the question and answer box then. And during Brian's talk, there was a question put in that asked, AI's binary system create the center of power excluding many. It has its hierarchy. The concept of subject position is characterized by activities that render power. AI can't assure that decentralization would move the very structural inequality. How do you minimize the danger in a binary structure unless you question the fundamental itself? And then Brian answered to that, but I just wanted to see if there was any additional follow-up you wanted to give there, Brian.
No, just to say that the very fact that you're setting up a hierarchy where some people have control and other people don't is setting up a system where certain types of virtues are going to be more possible than others. So I just want to validate that question as being what are we going to do here about this problem, right? We've got the AI acting in certain ways in society. We can try to use it in ways that are going to be more publicly beneficial, that are more democratic, more ground up. But as it's being implemented right now, it's very top down and centralizing technology in a lot of ways. I see Ahmed, you have your hand raised.
I was just going to ask a question of you, Brian, if I could. Hierarchy I get, but is the idea that AI creates a binary system in its nature or something we are imposing by virtue of misunderstanding the scope?
What do you mean misunderstanding? Say more.
So I don't understand what's meant by AI as a binary system. I worry that I'm missing something there regarding how people perceive what AI does or doesn't do, by collapsing it on a perhaps erroneous view of what computers offer us.
My interpretation of what the questioner was saying there was that it's binary in terms of some people control it and some people don't, or some people are in control of it and some people are not in control of it. I might be misinterpreting it though, so that was my take.
Oh, but even their degree of control varies. The example you gave of a surveillance state being turned against the rulers who are surveilling are all examples that belie this simplistic binary view. I was a little worried that there was a concern that AI is either good or bad, or that decisions are basically digital 0 or 1, which is understandable but incorrect.
Yeah, I think an interesting theme that I've sort of heard from a lot of these first presentations have been around institutions in a sense, whether it's a single government or whether we're talking on a global scale. And so that comes down to, I think, one of the fundamental methodological critiques of virtue, and that often being accused of being too culturally dependent. And then how do we actually have these meaningful conversations about virtue? On a multinational global scale, with very different understandings. We've had probably at least 3 or 4 different understandings of virtue already, and that's only going to continue to grow in the conversation.
I see, Elias, you have your hand up.
Yeah, that's actually a comment and a question for the whole group here. I mean, I noticed how, as we went to the different papers, even how we define AI is so much, it's very different. It is such a broad term. And I noticed, I think maybe it's a question from Braden. I figured it was the intention to be interdisciplinary and to leave it open. But I wonder to what extent do we need to have maybe some baseline agreement around what is AI and what isn't for us to maybe have a more fruitful conversation, or is it fine to just keep it open? Because there's machine learning, there's all the way to deep learning and AI, and then there's even automation and rule-based systems that are considered AI today. There's kind of this technical, there's the philosophical. I mean, there are many ways to go about it, but I do wonder if it would be helpful to have more of a baseline understanding of AI. So maybe it's a question for you, Braden, or the group that organized the conference.
Yeah, it's certainly an issue that we struggled with in writing the proposal, and then also trying to figure out the individual participants at a conference, because the tighter the definition you have for AI, the more that's going to narrow the focus of the work that's being done. And I think part of what we wanted to do was to cast a wide net, and that sure, we can talk about the idea of assisting in democratic process, using AI in that way versus collections. And then later on, we might hear about autonomous vehicles and Chat GPT. So I think being able to have people identify AI in a variety of ways allows us to have a larger conversation. Now, again, it's open to critique in the sense of there are some people that have dismissed the project out of hand to say, well, sure, my automobile right now doesn't have virtue. And we can argue whether or not that's true, because from an Aristotelian sense, if it's a well-designed vehicle, then it actually does have a sort of, basic sense of virtue. And I think there is also a degree of speculation, particularly as we move into the questions 2 and 3 being, how can AI help us with virtue, or can AI have virtue? That we're not there in the sense of having an AI that is human level intelligence, or is effective in any way, affective in any way. So yeah, I think being able to have a discussion of, well, if AI means this, then this, if it means that, then this, but it certainly can make communicating a little more difficult, and sometimes we have to spell out exactly what we mean. Yeah, Mark, go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to add yet another complexity to that, is that over the past 50, 60 years of AI development, a lot of what was considered AI early on then became just things that were part of software engineering, software development, computer engineering. And so there's also been a kind of a sliding window of what would be considered AI, and then what would also be part of another area. And that's just within computer science, where there's kind of the most technical definitions of AI. So then to expand in all the social use of that, I mean, that would be even more complicated. So I guess I would come down on I think it's very useful to discuss, but I think the value could only be in the discussion. I don't think we could actually come down to a definition of AI. And if we did, given that historical trajectory, then it would probably soon be, need to be replaced with something else.
Yeah, Ahmed.
For what it's worth, Braden, I'm very grateful that you guys took a broad and open look and didn't try to nail it down. Otherwise, we'd have been denied Michael's awesome view on structure. We would have been denied any kind of metastructure view of this. And to Mark's excellent point, what we called AI 20, 30, 40 years ago would make some people laugh if we called it AI today. So thank you for not being rigid on that and being more inclusive and broader.
Yeah, I would add to that looking forward, I mean, there's the looking back toward the Dartmouth conference and that kind of stuff and the intellectual history, but looking forward, I think it's also valuable to think that some of these terms are going to be contested in different ways. For me, the term machine learning, for instance, is highly contestable, even though it's kind of thought of, you know, it's built up a set of associations and there's a lot of power through the last 10 years of what has been called machine learning, but it's a very contestable term. The idea that machine learning inherently has to be data-based is just a, you know, that's a historical development. That's not conceptually needed for a machine to learn something, to not have rules, to not have explicit symbols. So, you know, I think some of these, I mean, part of being on a moving train and not being able to start, you know, at a static position of conceptual shared agreement is hard. But on the other hand, I think it's worth saying, you know, a lot of these things are in motion, and there's traction to be had on a lot of these concepts that are appealed to. And from my perspective, you know, machine learning, for instance, is a big one that has already slipped into a habitual reliance on data that isn't necessary. So thanks.
Thank you. I'm actually very excited about the historical dimension that is being added here. Where did AI come from? What is the technological, political, economic history of the current developments? And I understand maybe machine language is not the relevant term, but whatever name we want to use, I'm just very, very happy to see this historical dimension coming into play, because that is perhaps one of the two main points I want to raise in my presentation. So I just wanted to add a note of appreciation of this dimension. Thank you.
Yeah, the three core questions that we're sort of looking at in the grant of how is AI going to shape human culture? You know, can AI help us be more virtuous? And can we think of AI as having virtue? It's really, there are some ways in which you can answer one of those questions on their own, but there are a lot of ways, I think, in which you can see in the presentations even so far where those questions intermingle. And we're going to continue to see that in the next couple of days, where especially tomorrow, a lot of the questions, there'll be overlap between questions 1 and 2 and 2 and 3 in some of the presentations. But we really have tried to group things together that I think try and show that there's a thread going through these very different but very insightful papers.
Yeah, I'll just chime in here for a minute. This is Cyrus talking. So thank you. I wanted to raise a theme for us to consider together with respect to whether it's training data sets or the promise of less constrained decision making on the basis of how much information is actually crunched by the technology we have. To relate that to maybe, and this is on the theme with Michael's content and the information age and the city and libraries, but we already are thinking in terms of histories that both constrain and open us. How is it that we can continue to integrate a concern for history well contained in these training sets while remaining open to the kinds of creative innovations that are supposed to happen as we think of particular kinds of religious anthropologies about freedom and the person in response to the world in which they live. So a combination of history as complementary restraint on what is possible for humans, but also as something that remains open, since history is not yet closed, as it were, in certain religious perspectives. How do we incorporate this kind of historical thinking? Maybe it's historiography, I'm not sure, into our accounts of information as it's channeled through technology and communicated to the future, since we're also in the context where people are concerned about history's fabrication, history's reinterpretation, whatever that might mean, but also history's constraint in terms of limited data sets upon which AI systems are being trained, which encourage bias and don't incorporate a larger worldview, whether it's from refugees or marginalized and dehumanized groups in the world. So that's not really coherent. I just want to raise maybe the history question with respect to how it relates to everything from information encoded in material on up to the problems of bias and freedom that we encounter when we think about these things. So thank you.
Well, I think that's an important thing to bring up too in the context of something like ChatGPT, where it no longer answers certain types of questions because it's, there have been issues that have come up, and instead of embracing that history to say, well, this is what had been done, it's sort of erasing that institutional history in a sense of, oh, well, it hallucinated and gave us this information that turned out to be incorrect, and we're just starting to ignore that actually happened. And I think that's problematic.
Yeah, there's some systems now that do, or some versions of ChatGPT that provide at least some citations for things that they draw upon, right? So that's useful as well. I just think we have a lot of people here too, from Brian Green and others who have knowledge of genetics and how that influences information encoding, and so everything from the genes to forward in terms of how we're thinking of information and its history and its possible future. So.
And Cyrus, to add on to that, I mean, I would see, so from one hand, there's the question of history, the other, there's the question of imagination, of looking into the future, right? So to what extent is AI shaping our imagination of the future and what is possible? In some ways it is expanding, in some ways it's limiting. And I think that's a question I'm interested in as well. I mean, I guess we got to look both back and forward, but keep those in tension.
Yeah, for sure. I think that questions of with art generation from AI systems, right? I know Mark's created some AI art using various systems, and I do think there's an expansive imaginative possibility there, right? As with so much literature, music, and art. So I agree with you that there's a need to think about possibility and constraint at the same time, right? And maybe that's where our conversations about wisdom come in as key virtue, right?
Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to something you were saying, Braden, about the vulnerability of cultures to different understandings, or the vulnerability of virtue ethics to different cultural understandings of virtues. I think to a certain extent, people are willing to vote with their feet, right? If they're in a context where virtue is not being rewarded, or where vice is being rewarded, or in situations where society is just not working, right? If you have a certain level of vice riddenness in society, then people aren't going to like it. It's going to feel unpleasant. And at the same time, if you also take away too much of their freedom, then people tend to want to leave that sort of cultural situation that they're in. It'll be interesting to see going forward as how this plays out, right? The United States certainly is not the paragon of international virtue when it comes to gun crime, for example. While at the same time, many Americans would say, "Oh, I'd never live anywhere else because I wouldn't have my freedom." So there's this kind of constant trade-off between the way the individual is psychologically conceptualizing the situation that they're in, and the cultural, socio-political, milieu within which they are living. And it's just going to be interesting because the experiment's going to play out, right? We're conducting the experiment, and at the same time, you know, Elias and Brian Sigmon were talking about refugees. Some states are easier to leave than others, and some states are easier to move into than others. So there are also those sorts of questions. There's just lots and lots of variables. I don't know if that contributes to elucidating anything, but it at least complicates it.